Thank you so much. All right, welcome everybody to our IRB webinar. I'm just going to say hello for a second. On the screen, my name is Heather Miller. I'm one of the reviewers, and I'm here with our entire IRB team. We'll get to questions at the end. There is no questions. We have no chat open. We're going to get through a lot of material, and we're hopeful that this helps you as you go through the IRB process and think about your study. All right, so I'm going to stop my video, and we're going to start the presentation. This presentation is going to focus on alignment and IRB submissions. So when we think about this presentation, the goal of this presentation is to focus on what the eligibility criteria that you're going to use for your study, the alignment of your submission in terms of your recruitment information, your informed consent, and your site authorization, along with some extra information on both recruitment strategies and site authorization. For us to best help you, please remember, I've said this, but another reminder, we're going to have a Q&A at the end. I also would like you to please remember that we have IRB office hours every Wednesday at 10:30 a.m. Arizona time, and you can find the link to that on the DC network. We have fantastic information. The time that the entire team puts into the website, we have everything from help videos on submitting to IRIS, we have templates, and we really, really hope that you're using our website as we put a lot of time into that. If you have questions regarding the IRIS system, we have a dedicated email called IRIS Support. All of this is on the DC network, and of course, we also have an email address. So if you can't attend office hours and you have non-related IRIS questions. In a nutshell, we're here to help you. This webinar, however, is going to stay very focused. This webinar is focusing on human participants in less than minimal risk studies. While some of you might have other types of studies, for example, using archived data, or studies that are considered greater than minimal risk, like studies that deal with children or very sensitive topics, the fundamentals in this presentation will also be helpful to you. But when creating this presentation, it was created with what we mostly see, which are studies that are greater than minimal risk. So let's just take a quick gander at our fabulous, I know I've said it before, but I'm going to say it again, our IRB page on the DC network. We have all kinds of information. You're going to see right there at the beginning, we have the IRB office hours that are hosted every Wednesday. So tomorrow morning, we hope that you'll be able to join us if you have any additional questions. But for the sake of this presentation, we're going to focus on the IRB forms and templates. You'll see that that's the second button on the left once you log into the IRB page on the DC network. Now, when you get to these IRB pages on the DC network, there is a lot of information. We understand that. That's just the nature of the beast, but we have a lot of information to provide you with the best opportunities for success. On this presentation, I have put little red arrows where you're really going to want to focus, and that's on the informed consent for not greater than minimal risk studies, the recruitment template, and the site authorization template. So this presentation is focusing on those forms, just so you're clear as we move forward in the presentation. And so the first thing I wanted to do is to make sure that we're all on the same playing field to know what's what. Sometimes it gets a little bit confusing. So recruitment. Recruitment is what you use to get your participants, to get them involved with the study. Like if you're at the Panera Bread shop and you're looking at one of their public boards, the recruitment is what you might read on a flyer. It could be an email that you get into your inbox. It's basically the first glance for a participant to see what's going to happen in your study. Site authorization is the permission that you need from a place. Like, for example, if you were going to ask a school to do something for you, or a nonprofit, or a hospital, or a business, you have to get permission, and we'll talk more about that. There's also times when you need permission from closed groups. Like Facebook, for example, has closed social media groups, and so sometimes you need to have permission from them too, and we'll get to that. And then finally, the star of this presentation is informed consent. Informed consent is the most important document. We're going to be spending time on that today so that you can understand the importance and how it aligns with other parts of the IRB process. And think of informed consent as everything that tells a participant about what's going to happen. It's like the one-stop shopping. It is everything that a participant would need to know about your research and what they're going to be expected to do. So we're going to talk about that today in this presentation. All right, so what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about alignment. Any doctoral learner has learned about alignment. You hear it throughout all of your coursework. What I did in this screen that you're looking at is I took just pieces of our informed consent, our recruitment, and our site authorization template. I just put them all three together, squashed them on my screen, and took a screenshot. And then I made circles. The importance of this, and you're going to see this slide several times, is to think about the alignment across these three documents. If you were to print out 3 documents and put them on your kitchen table and look at them, you would want to make sure that these documents are all saying the same thing, that the participant knows what to expect. That's in the informed consent. That the participant read the same information in the recruitment when they were staring at the flyer at the Panera Bread, and that the site, if you need permission to conduct the study, is saying the same thing that the participants think that they're going to do and how you entice them in the first place. So when you put yourself in the position of the IRB process, I thought if you could think a little bit like a reviewer and what we're looking for, that would really be helpful. When I review IRB applications and when our team looks at information, we make sure that everything that you ask the participants to do is aligned across this information, across the informed consent, across the recruitment documentation, and that the folks at the site know exactly what you're asking them to do and what those participants are going to do. So in this time, I want you to think like you would be if you're looking at your application and you're not tied to the research. Think of it like you would be somebody who's going to participate in your own study. All right, so let's think a little bit here for a second. If you're going to ask participants to be in your study, what does that list look like? What are you asking of your participants? How long is it going to take them? And are you asking a site to do something for you? Are you asking a business to send out emails to their employees? Are you asking a school to interview their teachers? Are you asking a clinical practice to access their psychologist? What is it that you're going to do? And what is the list of the people, the actual human participants, if you were to sit down right now on your desk or on your kitchen table or thinking about it while you're listening to this presentation, what is that exact list of the criteria that identifies the people you need for your study? All right, so let's think about this for a second. As you go through all of the coursework and when you look at the templates for your prospectus and your proposal and your final study, we all know that we have to address population and sampling strategy. That's part of all of our information. The IRB comes after, of course, your approved proposal. And what I want you to think about is, yes, you know your population, you know your participants, some of them are going to end up in your sample, but think about how are you going to get them? How are you going to recruit them? Are you going to hang up a flyer? Are you going to post it on social media? Are you going to send out some sort of an announcement? And what are the criteria that you need to get the people? All of the characteristics about the participants that you want. So if you are a possible participant, remember, you're putting yourself in the shoes of your participants. Would you know if you qualify for your study? Are the criteria so clear that as a participant, you could look at a sign and go, yep, I can be in that study, or nope, I don't meet the criteria? That's what we need to focus on for this presentation. So when you think about yourself as a researcher, you want to make sure that the participants are clear. And I'm going to give you just a minute of backstory on this. The IRB functions under something called Code of Federal Regulations, and this Code of Federal Regulations protects human participants. Recently, the code was updated. And when I say recently, it was this year, January of 2019, that it was finally implemented after a lot of chatting back and forth with lots of people for a couple years. But the new regulations clearly say that participants must be 100% clear what they're going to get into for a research project, period. So what that means is that when we're doing this type of research, social, behavioral, educational research, they need to be able to look at the flyer and know if they can or cannot participate in the research. They have to understand the types of questions that they're going to answer. They have to understand what the study is about, and they have to understand how much time it's going to take them. Again, start thinking of yourself as a participant in your own research study. So what this means is that you cannot collect data, you may not collect data prior to the informed consent process. The informed consent, as I stated earlier, is that one stop. It's the one stop for the participant to know everything. And you're not able to collect data. It's not permitted prior to presenting that to the possible participants. So we'll talk more about that. But what that means is that, again, and you can think about this, again, as somebody who would be in your study, you don't want to give your personal information to somebody you don't know willy-nilly, right? We're very guarded with our data. It's a part of the news every day about protecting your private information. We know not to give somebody who calls up with our personal Social Security, our mother's maiden name, and our high school mascot. That's just not something that we do. So along those lines, when you think about folks who might participate in your study, you have to know that they have to go through the informed consent process prior to you collecting that data. That means that the eligibility criteria, again, all of those characteristics of the folks you want to be in your study have to be clear. All right, so let's think a little bit about this, all right? Again, I know I keep saying it, but I think sometimes we get so close to our research and it's so important to us, we forget that we're actually asking other folks to participate. So as a researcher, one of the things that we often see in the IRB is demographic information being asked of the participants. So a lot of times this demographic information is not related to the purpose of the study. It's not reflected in the title. And it would be kind of a surprise for a participant. So in the IRB world, we have two options, and I'm going to go through this. But some types of personal demographic information that we see that's not related to the purpose of the study are things like, what's your sexual preference? Are you married, divorced, single, or widowed? Do you have children with diseases? How much money do you make? Are you an illegal immigrant? What's your education level? What's your race? What's your ethnicity? We'll see this in the IRB, and as we understand, it's part of the data collection process for some studies. However, it's not aligned across the information. Now remember, I showed you the informed consent, the recruitment, and the site authorization. And this information and what you're asking of those human participants has to be 100% clear. They can't get into a study and then all of a sudden personal information is being asked of them. And again, think right now, if I was to call you up on the phone and start asking you these personal questions, chances are you would hang up on me because you don't know me, and why would I be asking you these questions? Same thing with your research participants. The information has to be clear. So it's possible to get it, but you just have to let them know you're going to ask. So let's think about this for a second. Let's pretend we're doing a study on the benefits of dog walking for women over 30. Let's just say that this is one of my most favorite topics. So the eligibility criteria might be something like, you have to be a female, you have to be over 30, and you have to walk your dogs at least 2 times per week. So as somebody who's reading a flyer, when I'm standing around at the Panera Bread, I would think, oh, I'm over 30, I'm a female, and I walk my dogs a couple times per week, so I can be in this person's study. So then I sit down with this person to talk about dog walking, and they ask me things like, well, how much money do you make? What's your highest level of education? How do you identify with gender? What's your race? Are you married, single, or widowed? There's a multitude of challenges that could occur by asking these personal questions. First of all, as a participant, I might not know if you're really having a study about dog walking or if you have something to do with race and the type of dog you have, or gender identity and how often you're exercising, or maybe are you looking to see you know, my education level, and my education level is related to the type of dogs. So these are questions that are not directly related to the study. Again, the information, personal demographic questions that are not related to this research have to be included across all of the documents. And let me show you what I mean by that. So let's say, for an example, your study is about the purpose of females who are over 30 years old who want to know the benefits of dog walking. So your recruitment criteria might be female over 30 years old who walks her dogs at least 2 times per week. And you can't be in the study if you're not a female, you're less than 30, and you're not a dog walker, and you don't walk your dogs 2 times per week. Now, if you want to ask those types of personal questions, that's absolutely fine. But again, you have to let the participants know what the study is going to be about. So in this case, you would say, okay, I need to know those types of questions. So you're going to ask, I need participants that are female, over 30, they walk their dogs at least 2 times per week, and they're willing to answer questions related to race, income, gender identity, education, and marriage. And you can't be in the study if you're not willing to answer these types of questions. Again, think of it from the point of view of the participant. If you enroll to be in a study and you think it's about one thing, and then all of a sudden people are asking you personal identifiable information that's not related to it, it would be a surprise. Again, the criteria that have rolled out with the federal regulations have clearly said that IRBs must have informed consent letters that are absolutely clear to the participants and must include what's called key information. And that key information is what needs to be clear to the participants. So what I did here in this slide is I'm just showing you a snapshot of our informed consent template and what it would look like if you were to have the 2 different types of questions as part of your criteria. Again, in one of the key information, the personal questions aren't there, and then the other informed consent, the key information contains those personal questions. So it's up to you as the researcher whether or not you choose to have that be part of your study, but the participants have the right to know what they're going to be asked. This is a very key point, and this must align throughout your informed consent, your recruitment, and your site authorization. And we'll circle back on that in a second here. The other thing that needs to be very clear for the participant is they need to know how long it's going to take to be a member, to be in your study. How long is it going to take? Is it going to take them an hour for the interview? Is it going to take them 30 minutes for the questionnaire? Are they going to have to participate in both answering questions on the questionnaire and be in the interview? It needs to be very clear how much time they're committing to the process. So this is the real time it will take to be in the study. So if you're going to interview me and we're going to sit down, let's say at the Phoenix Public Library, you're going to say, hey, Heather, how are you? How was your day? You know, what was it like to get here? Oh, I hope traffic wasn't so bad. Thank you for showing up. You're going to have a few minutes of time to get folks settled and involved in the study. So you want to let them know how long is it going to take for them to participate in your study. And again, just like the criteria, the time commitment and the activities that the participant is going to do must align across all of the documents. Again, in this little screenshot here, under key information, part of the key information is, what am I being asked to do, what, when, and where? And 1 to 2 sentences. It has to be very clear what the participant is going to have to do. That's also on the recruitment document. Hey, if you want to be in our study, this is what the criteria that you need to have, and this is where it's going to happen. And it's going to take this long. It's going to take interviews, you're going to have focus groups, or whatever it is, you have to have the real time. And if you are seeking permission from a site and you're using the resources of a site, the site also needs to know what they are providing you. So for example, if it's a nonprofit and they're providing you with a conference room, how long will you be using that conference room for? The site needs to know, and they have to be able to articulate that in the site authorization agreement so everybody's on the same page. Again, alignment across all of these forms is critical. So I just here included a little tiny screenshot again of what it looks like in both our informed consent and our recruitment template. So I just cut out the pieces of those parts of our templates, and you're going to see I'm being asked to participate in a one-to-one interview for 1 hour and or answer questions related to your dog walking habits about 30 minutes. It's going to be held at your convenience. It's going to be held at the Phoenix Public Library in a conference room. The questionnaire link will be sent to you via email. The interviews will be in person, face-to-face. The questionnaires will be emailed to you so you can complete them at your convenience. And that information is aligned with the information that they initially saw that says, yep, one-to-one interviews for approximately 1 hour at the Phoenix Public Library, and the questionnaire is about 20 minutes. Oh, and you can see, so the questionnaire has to be online from your computer, and they should be the same. The time commitment should be the same. Again, in the site authorization, it also has to be the same. I have indicated to Heather Miller that Phoenix Public Library will allow the following research activities: interviews of female dog walkers that are at least 30 years old. We understand these interviews will be conducted between August 2019 and December 2020, I should have put, and it will be around 1 hour. And lots of times site authorizations will put in information that they want you to do. Heather will schedule all rooms at least 1 week in advance, because the site has to provide you with a service. So you're going to need to find out exactly what the site is going to do for you, and that information needs to be clearly articulated in the site authorization agreement. And again, not to beat a dead horse, but it has to align across all of the information. Now, one thing to think about, and what I have here is parts of the IRB application within our online submission system that also asks you the similar information, how long it's going to take and what the criteria are. One thing that I recommend is when you sit down to start this whole IRB process, I recommend that you start with the informed consent letter, because again, that sums up your entire study. It's the most important document of the entire IRB package, because it's what gets presented to the participants. So I recommend that you start with that information that we have in the DC network for you on the informed consent and the recruitment, and then finally the site, so that you have those 3 documents in front of you. If you have those 3 documents in front of you and you've gone through it, you know everything, and you read that document like you're going to be a research participant, it's going to really help you when you get to answering the questions within our online submission system, IRIS. As part of our online submission system, we ask you to describe the research activities. We ask you to describe the inclusion criteria, what it means to be a participant in that study, and the exclusion criteria. And if you've already fleshed all of that out, it's going to be super cinchy for you to go back and fill this out within our submission system. So I highly recommend, again, that you start with those informed consent letters, then you move to the recruitment and the site authorization to make sure everything is aligned. And again, and I know I keep saying it, but you need to think about yourself as the participant in your study. What would you need to know to be a participant in your study? So now that we have discussed both recruitment, the eligibility to be in your study, informed consent, and site authorization alignment, I want to give you guys a little bit of this time to think about informed consent and recruitment. So let's first consider how you're going to recruit participants. And I just want to take a moment for anybody who stepped in late. We will have questions that we will answer at the end of the presentation. So if you could just please hold your questions right now, and we will get to the questions related to this presentation shortly. So you have now considered all of the criteria to be a participant in your study, how long it's going to take, and information that you're trying to get from those participants. So now let's talk a little bit about the best way to find your participants. How many do you need? What connections do you have? How are you going to start to get the people to be in your study? So let's talk for a second about recruitment strategies. Recruitment, again, as I mentioned earlier, is that piece, you know your population, you know your sampling strategy, but how are you going to get them to participate in your study? That's recruitment. And there's lots of different types of recruitment strategies to consider. And you're going to want to consider your position both as a graduate learner and then also your position as a professional, and how can you go ahead and get folks to be involved in your study. So for example, we have something called passive recruitment. Passive recruitment is sending out flyers, emails, posting on social media like Facebook where you're just scrolling through, LinkedIn, there's public boards like I was mentioning earlier at the Panera Bread or any coffee shop that a participant would scroll through or read your flyer and they would say, yep, I'm eligible and I have the time and I want to participate in this study. That's called passive recruitment. There's another recruitment strategy that's becoming more and more popular, and this is using companies to help recruit participants for you. There are many different companies. These are the ones that I have seen the most in the last 6 months. SurveyMonkey. SurveyMonkey is both a company that will recruit participants and an app to collect data. Of course, you've heard of SurveyMonkey. Qualtrics, just SurveyMonkey's competitors for all practical purpose. Again, it's an app to collect information. You could have your own, you could pay for using Qualtrics as an app, or they also have a service where they'll help you get research participants. MTurk, it's a company owned by Amazon. They have they're kind of steeping into more psychological type things. Prolific is a research company. If you were just to Google Prolific, they're also a company that will both support your interface, so they'll put your information up on their site and they'll recruit people with your eligibility criteria. So for example, if you were doing a quantitative study and you had a survey that you wanted to send out to women over 30 who walk their dogs 2 times per week, SurveyMonkey, Qualtrics, MTurk, Prolific, all of these places guarantee that you'll have a complete data set and that the people who answer the data set will meet your criteria. So if you're curious if any of these companies can help you, some of them are even now dabbling in getting participants for qualitative research. It used to be that we spoke about these companies only for distributing surveys, but as it turns out, some of them now dabble in getting participants for qualitative research. I recommend that you just sit down and make yourself a canned email with all of the criteria of your participants, how many you need, and send the same one to all of them and see what happens. You might have some luck and finding participants that way too. It is not cheap, but it is very quick. Just to give you an example, one of my own learners used Prolific, and in the course of 40 minutes, he had 200 complete data sets from a survey that took 30 minutes long, and he was focusing on millennials. So it's just worth looking at. Another recruitment strategy is having help from a local business or an organization or a school or a clinic. So of course, many of you in your professional roles have access to participants. And as long as there's not some sort of coercion and all full disclosure of information, you might have access or within your position of employment. Like say, for example, you were an employee at Google and you got permission from Google to interview fellow employees at your same level about their benefits plan. There's all types of ways. So you need to consider how you're going to recruit so that you can get the participants that you want for your study. Now with that, with any type of research, there's always feasibility issues. And on our page in the DC network, we have a little handout that will help you think about this. But when you're thinking about how you're going to recruit and get participants, you need to consider the time it's going to take. So sometimes passive recruitment, that means like hanging up a flyer, scrolling through on LinkedIn or Snapchat or Facebook. All of that can take a lot of time in order to get the participants that you need. This is especially true when you're trying to enlist participants for a quantitative study and you need a large sample size. The other thing to consider regarding feasibility is getting folks to participate. So are you asking questions that people don't want to answer? Meaning, are you asking questions that are personal in nature and that would prevent people from participating in your study due to the nature of those questions? Again, put yourself in the seat of the participant. That also goes with time. If you're asking your participants for 5 hours of their time, when was the last time you personally dedicated 5 hours to voluntarily do something for somebody you didn't know? And I'm not talking about like your kid's soccer game or an organization or a church that you belong to and you're volunteering on the weekends. I'm talking about just like something completely not related to what you're doing. So think about what you're asking and how long it's going to take them. Another thing to do is to think about budgeting a small incentive that's available for participants. Incentives can be something like a gift card to a local restaurant or a gift card for being part of the process. That's something to consider and budget in your overall plan as a researcher. And finally, those services that I listed, SurveyMonkey, Qualtrics, these are all things that you need to discuss, of course, with your committee and the folks that are involved with your research to see what their perspectives are, but they're options to consider, and while expensive, they can guarantee those participants and data sets. So those are all things to consider. All right, so now we're going to focus for a second on site authorization and how this relates to you as a researcher. Site authorization is not always needed. So the easiest way to think about site authorization and when it is needed is when you're creating, and I'm air quoting, work for somebody else because you're using the resources at that office. For example, if I want to interview participants at the Phoenix Public Library and I'm creating work for their schedulers because I have to schedule a conference room. I'm going to need a chair, a couple of chairs in there. I might want to have water available for my participants during the interview. You need to get, permission to use that site. Another example would be if you are going to use a conference room in a clinic because you're going to interview other clinicians about post-traumatic stress helping their patients. So you're going to be using the clinic's resource. You're going to be sitting down in a chair in their conference room and you're going to be using their resource. Maybe you're asking the clinic to send an email to all therapists who are having, stress from their clients. They're doing work for you. They're doing something for you. They're giving you something. They're allowing you to use their physical space. Another time that you would need site authorization in a case that's not a physical space is if you're asking to go to a closed group on social media. Facebook, for example, has closed groups. They have groups that have everything closed. For example, veterans that were in Afghanistan at a certain time period might be a closed group and you want to recruit participants from that site. Then you would need to have permission from the group moderator. Some site authorizations can be very time consuming and you need to consider this when setting up your research. For example, any type of clinic or hospital or school or university, anything else that has its own IRB will require you to go through their IRB and then come back to our IRB. So you're going to want to empower yourself with your situation and what's present there. If an IRB is present at one of those sites, so say your school district has a human ethics board, they might not call it an IRB, but let's say your school district has a human ethics board, you're going to have to go back and forth to that human ethics board, and then you have to come back and forth to us. That can take time. So when you set up your project, you're going to want to be sure that you empower yourself with all of the information to know about how much time it's going to take. The next slide is showing you also when it's required. Again, I've already reviewed this, but when you're going to use the physical location, when you have somebody doing work for you, you know, that's the easiest way to think about when you need site authorization. And when in doubt, you can always reach out to us and we'll help you. So this is a side note, GCU will only consider site authorization from doctoral learners who meet criteria if they have a clear affiliation with GCU as a full-time or adjunct faculty member, they work for GCU in another full-time capacity, or they have approval from administrative leadership. What this means is that we as researchers can't use each other. This is especially important for doctoral learners. And if you think about that, that makes perfect sense. The research fatigue, and it's really not getting what you need out of for your study. So GCU will not facilitate recruitment and site authorization to collect from doctoral learners at all anymore. So again, this is all published on our network site, and there's information there more about this, but please don't count on GCU recruiting for you. You need to think about how you're going to recruit for your own study. So when is site authorization not needed? It's not needed when it is a passive recruitment strategy, like I'm going to post on my Facebook page about finding women who are greater than 30 years old who walk their dogs twice a week, or if they post on a public board, or you don't need site authorization if a company is going to recruit for you. That is, if you're working with SurveyMonkey doesn't give you site authorization. They're going to be your whole recruitment strategy. We're going to talk more about what that looks like in our next webinar, using these companies to help you recruit participants. But site authorization, again, is not needed if it's a passive recruitment strategy. Now, again, think about these feasibility issues. So that's why I say empower yourself with the information so you understand the process that you're going to need to do your study. There can be issues related to passive recruitments, and that it could take a long time to get folks to participate in interviews or surveys. Maybe the posts will be deleted, signs can be torn down. If you have multiple layers of gaining site authorization, like a hospital or a clinic or a school, you're going to want to make sure that you understand what you need to do and who the gatekeepers are. And in all cases, there's not a magic way to get participants quickly, and all forms of recruitment and site authorization should be considered. And this should all be considered on the early onsets as you're considering your study and your participants and what you're asking them. So finally, thank you so much. We're going to open it up here for questions shortly. If you have issues with our submission system, please contact irisupport@gcu.edu. Please take the time to review the IRB information on the DC network. We have lots of helpful videos. You can listen to them on your way to work. You can use them for your children as bedtime stories. They will go to sleep very quickly that way. But we really, truly have lots of videos and tips, and using both our online submission system and about our process. If you have questions regarding this particular presentation, you can find me, Heather Miller, with the #1 at my.gcu.edu. And please copy irb@gcu.edu. It helps our team stay in line. And again, I cannot stress enough our fabulous office hours that we offer every Wednesdays, where Dr. Ramya Charaga and Dr. Linda Guerra answer questions about the IRB systems and processes every 10:30 to 11:30 a.m. Arizona time. So at this time, I am going to stop sharing my screen. I see a couple of questions are coming up. Can site authorization requests be sent while you're working on your proposal? And yes, but site authorization is good for only 1 year. And often you want to keep your committee informed because things can change in what you're going to be asking the participants. Remember, it has to be completely clear to your participants about what you're going to ask. And while you can get preliminary site authorization, like checking in with the site, the exact specifics of your study will be determined with your committee and knowing exactly the eligibility of your participants. Okay, I'm trying to look at the questions here. Is there a limit on how much the incentive gift cards can have? Absolutely. It depends on your participants. So for example, incentives are a great thing to budget, but one thing that you're going to want to consider is how much that person is. So if it's an 18-year-old, you're not going to offer them $100. That would be crazy. That would be coercive, right? But if it is a nursing professional, let's say a nurse practitioner, and you want to interview them and they're going to keep journals and they're going to do multiple things, the money could be more. So it's up to your participants and how much time they're going to be in the study, so enough that it could be incentivizing but not coercive.
Heather, a couple of people have asked about the presentation, and so and if the availability of this presentation, it will be posted on the DC network. They will have a copy of the PowerPoint slides, and also in a few days we'll render this video presentation along with closed caption, and it will be posted on the DC network as well. So give us a few days to get everything posted up, and then you will have access to it and be able to refer back to it after we finish up today.
Yes, we're hopeful that will be soon.
So the next question we have is recruiting participants through our personal social media networks. However, I was under the impression that we could not interview people that we know for our studies. This is for a qualitative descriptive study. Yes, so to answer that question, you have to be careful when you recruit people that you know. So as long as you are addressing issues of bias, so when you know people already, how are you going to address bias? You want to be careful that you don't have any bias when you're collecting data or analyzing the data. And at the same time, if any of these people work under you, then that is again a possibility of coercion. So you need to address that. And the third thing you want to consider is to avoid any undue influence on these people. They shouldn't feel obligated to participate. So these are some of the things that you need to consider.
Okay, let's see here. Couple questions. I was always told not to pay for participants, and I think Dr. Miller addressed that question. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but incentives for participating in research are allowable if it all, matches the study and some of the criteria that Dr. Miller had described earlier.
Oh, and I want to add to that. Somebody's asking about if I'm using SurveyMonkey, do I need to send them incentives? So if you're using SurveyMonkey as an app, like just a way to deliver questions, you're not using them for a recruitment platform, you're just using them, to send out your survey, then you can offer an incentive, like if you want to be in a raffle, please include your name and I'll send you, whatever, a gift card to Amazon. But if you're using SurveyMonkey, Prolific, MTurk, any of those companies that I mentioned for, as you're paying them as a service to recruit for you, then you don't give them an incentive. You don't give anybody an incentive. In fact, that's something we look for at the reviewer level. The company goes ahead and the SurveyMonkey reimburses every participant with whatever agreement they have with them. You pay SurveyMonkey, and they deal with the participants from that end. I see some questions about IRB approval. Sites request GCU IRB approval first or second. And we work with sites like that all the time. And what will happen is, depending upon the study, we can issue letters called conditional approval, which says you're approved from the GCU IRB, and the only condition is approval from the other site. And this is very common. IRBs know that language when talking with each other. So you go back and forth a little bit. Again, that can add a little bit of time to the process because we say conditional approval, or they might say conditional approval, and then you go back and forth until they both grant approval.
There is a question from Charlotta. The question is, one of my sites is asking if there are any contract requirements. So just so you all know, a site authorization letter is a sort of agreement between you as the researcher and the site. So in that letter, you need to be very clear on what the site is agreeing to do. For example, if the study is greater than minimal risk study, or if the participants are under distress, who is responsible to take care of the participants? What kind of resources are you requesting from site? All that information needs to be laid out in the site authorization letter. So we have a template for site authorization letter on our IRB page under forms and templates. So please be sure to take a look at that, and that should provide all the details that you need. And then we have a question from Kenneth Mitchell. To clarify sections 6 and 7 in the IRB application, the site authorization, recruitment, and implied consent information must align between all the areas. That's correct. That's exactly what this presentation is about. Alignment is key for the IRB review process. So you need to make sure that things are consistent. Everything, especially the eligibility criteria and the research activities, should be consistent among your IRB application, the site authorization letter, your recruitment script, and the informed consent. Then we have a question. If a learner does utilize social media, the stance is a site authorization is not required, and it has to be written in the proposal/dissertation. So social media site authorizations can be two kinds. So if you're recruiting using social media, there are two types. One is if you're posting the recruitment script on your own profile, or recruiting using a public group where everybody can access that page, then you don't need a site authorization letter. However, if you're using a closed group that is monitored by a group administrator, then you definitely need a site authorization from the group administrator before you can recruit participants from that closed Facebook or closed social media group. So we have a question from Dr. Brown, response from an IRB a few weeks ago. Outside IRB would take responsibility. So to address that, if you submit to us with an outside IRB approval, and that outside IRB approval letter clearly states what kind of review category it is, it means that that IRB will be overseeing the study, and that outside IRB would be responsible to oversee your study. So what that means is, the responsibility means that they will oversee the study to see if there are any issues during data collection, if the participants are, if there are any issues from the participants during data collection, so on and so forth. There is a question that is asking about conflict of interest form. So we no longer require you to submit a conflict of interest or a confidentiality agreement as a separate document. These documents have been merged into our IRB application form, so you don't need to submit them as separate documents in your IRB submission.
I'd like to answer Jeanette's question about site authorization from 4 universities is contingent upon GCU IRB approval. She wrote, when do I get this approval from GCU? So again, as I said in the other one, if you have permission from another IRB, or you're waiting for our approval, we'll review the information that you submitted to their IRB. So we make sure it's congruent with what you told us. And if they've given you an approval with condition, and the condition is our IRB, and you've already gone through their IRB, then we can decide, okay, we're ready to approve it, and then you have to go back to them, or we can do an approval with condition. So it just sort of depends upon what you're asking and what the university asks for. So every IRB handles things a teeny tiny bit differently. And so it won't be, if you have 4 different universities involved in your study, it won't be the same for every one of your universities. So you'll want to submit what you have, and then we'll review everything. And sometimes we have to issue separate documents depending upon the university.
I just wanted to mention that we still have 9 minutes, so we'll get to as many questions as we can, and we will make sure that we make a note of your questions. If you're not able to get to it, we'll try to get answers to those and post them as well on the DC network.
I see a question from Mary Power. If a questionnaire takes only 15 minutes, I would think that no incentive is necessary. This has to do with recruitment, and that, you know, Mary, it depends upon what you're asking and who the participants are. Some folks are really gung-ho about answering questions and others aren't. It just sort of depends. And so maybe you have a double layered strategy. You try for 3 weeks without including an incentive, and then if you have to, you can do a modification within the IRB process and then come back and a small incentive. There's never a magic bullet in getting folks to respond as quick as you would like, unless you use one of those services. And again, that's up to your committee. It's just an option.
Okay, we have a question from Lisa Battle, and she's asking, if you are an IRB already and the reviewer asked you to identify an exact location for your interviews, will you need to get additional site authorization? So the question is, the whole point about site authorization is, if you're using resources from the site, it could be conference room, you're using desk and chair, you're using any kind of resource from the site, then yes, you would need to get a site authorization letter.
And I would like to address a couple of questions simultaneously from both Lisa Williams and Obi regarding informed consent. Informed consent can be sent electronically via email. And Obi, you're asking about, is it compulsory for participants to write their actual names? If a participant, if the IRB decides that the participant has to sign the informed consent, then yes, they always put their actual names. Sometimes in cultural situations, in some places, there's something called a written waiver of documentation, which means the researcher still gives out the informed consent, but that they don't collect the names of the participants on the informed consent. That can happen in some situations when you're actually face-to-face. And if you're doing an anonymous survey, you'll look at our informed consent template, and you'll notice that depending upon if you're doing an anonymous survey, and we'll cover this at length in the next webinar, but the participants wouldn't provide their name. They would just click on the agree button. If it's truly an anonymous study, nobody would know who was in that study. So it depends upon the study and but in a nutshell, you never ask people to write fake names on the signature line of an informed consent. So I think that we'll do that. Daryl's, and more about informed consent. If there's a focus group, can you use the same consent form? And yes, we used to have, last year, we used to have some different forms, but now it's all part of one form, and to simplify the process for everybody.
Heather or Ramya, do you want to, there was a question about bias, and if they've worked, how should bias be addressed in their document and in the ethical area if the place of employment, if the study is being done at the place of employment where you work or previously worked. So I don't know if you want to take a quick shot at that.
So bias basically means that, you know, how are you going to, so sometimes when you're too comfortable with someone, you may not want to ask them certain questions. Say you're interviewing a participant whom you know already, and there are certain questions that may not be appropriate that you would like to ask. Then you need, that is kind of bias because you don't want to ask the person you know those questions. So those kind of things, that's a bias, and that is something that you need to address. How will you address bias in such a situation? And that is definitely something that you would address in the ethical considerations area in your proposal as well as your dissertation.
And I would also just add that, you, of course, anytime you're doing a study at your place of employment or a place where you previously worked, the issue of coercion is also a consideration that needs to be addressed as well. So I think, you know, those are important things to kind of keep in mind as you think about conducting a study at the site where you work or where you previously worked. And if you have a managerial role and you're asking people that you either manage or formerly managed to be part of your study.
Okay, and then we have a question from OB. On a research that will take place in a foreign country, do I need IRB approval from the foreign country? So for all international studies, if the country has an ethics review board or an institutional review board, then we require approval from the ethics committee before we can review your study. Okay, we just have 3 minutes before we end the webinar. So we can answer one last question if somebody would like to do that.
I will go down a little bit more about incentives. I see another question here from Moses. Do we have to disclose the type and amount of incentive? Yes. The short answer is all incentives are clearly laid out in the recruitment and in the informed consent information, and it's 100% clear, and the IRB reviews it to make sure that the incentive is in line with the study and not coercive to the participants.
And one last question, is it appropriate to give a sample question when presenting the interview information to the participant? So you may not present the actual interview questions, but you can just give the participant some idea on what kind of questions will be asked, maybe a couple of sentences. So the participants are prepared that they may be asked questions relating to their ethnicity or income, so on and so forth. But you may not present the actual questions to them ahead of time, because that can basically create a little bit of, you know, that can affect the validity of the data, so to speak.
Thank you, everybody, for attending our presentation. Special thanks to our amazing IRB team, Dr. Ramya Charaga, who's the chair, Latrice Smith, who is our IRIS guru, Dr. Cindy Bainbridge, who's our director and assistant dean, and Dr. Linda Garrett, who helps us with support from everything from running office hours to answering questions regarding our support. We are very grateful that you all took the time, and we look forward to supporting you more in the future, and we hope to see you at our next webinar. And thank you again for everything.
Before we end the presentation, I would like to mention that we have another webinar scheduled for the 27th of August at 2 p.m. And in that webinar, we will discuss the type of informed consents that you would like to consider based on how you're administering the data collection procedure. And the second thing we'll talk about is things to consider when you're using multiple sources of data. And we hope to see you there. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.